Baby Bear begged for help. Then Officer realized the reason and was shocked. At dawn, the forests near Flagstaff, Arizona were cloaked in a hush that only early winter mornings could bring. Frost coated the pine needles and the underbrush with a silvery sheen, and the air smelled of sap, cold earth, and the faint memory of last night's snow. Officers James Carter and Emily Brooks trudged quietly along a narrow trail, their breath rising in soft clouds and boots crunching softly over frozen twigs. This stretch of forest was familiar to them, part of their usual wildlife patrol route. But that morning something felt different. Not dangerous, not wrong, just different, like the forest was holding its breath. James adjusted the collar of his jacket, glancing toward a ridge where the pale pink of morning light filtered through the trees. "You hear that?" he murmured. Emily paused beside him, listening. The forest was still, too still. No bird song, no rustling deer in the underbrush. Then a sound, a soft rustle, deliberate and near. Both officers turned toward it, hands resting instinctively on their belts. From behind a thicket of manzanita and dry pine needles, a small shape emerged. James took half a step back before freezing. It was a bear cub, but not like any they'd encountered before. The cub wasn't running or hiding or issuing the usual fearful cries that cubs made when lost or startled. This one walked slowly toward them with measured steps, its fur as black as the shadowed pine trunks, its nose twitching slightly. It stopped a few feet away, locking eyes with James, deep, intelligent eyes, round and gleaming with something he couldn't quite name. Not fear, not aggression. It was closer to urgency, a need. Emily crouched slightly, lowering her voice. "Is it injured?" she asked. James shook his head slowly. "No, it doesn't look afraid either." As they watched, the cub turned around, took a few steps back toward the woods, then stopped and looked over its shoulder. Waiting, watching, almost beckoning. Then it walked again, into the thickening forest. It stopped, looked back, walked, stopped. "What the hell?" James muttered, stepping forward. Emily followed, radio at her side. The cub was leading them, not fleeing, and that was the most peculiar part. They followed for nearly half a mile, deeper into the woods than either had been since early summer. The ground dipped into a hollow where the pines grew tall and thick, blocking most of the rising light. Here, the world was a quiet cathedral of snow-muffled silence and brittle, bare branches. The cub stopped just beyond a moss-covered rock outcropping and stood very still, and that's when they saw her. Nestled into a natural den beneath a low overhang of granite and tangled roots lay a full-grown female black bear. Her body was half-curled, her breathing shallow. Her massive flank rose and fell slowly, and one of her hind legs was dark with dried blood. A wound, swollen and glistening in the low light, was visible near her haunch. Even from where they stood, James could see the infection had set in. "Oh my God," Emily breathed. "She's pregnant." Her gaze dropped to the swollen belly that rose gently with each labored breath. James knelt slowly, careful not to spook the cub. "This is what it wanted us to see." "She's not going to make it without help," Emily said, already reaching for her phone. "Not like this. And if she's close to labor—" James didn't reply. He was staring at the cub, which had crept closer to the mother, nestling near her shoulder and laying its small head across her back. It wasn't fear driving it. It was protection, worry. The bear cub had sought them out, not to flee humans, but to ask for help. Within 2 hours, wildlife veterinarian Dr. Sarah Martinez arrived. Her truck rolled quietly through the service trail, and she approached the site with practiced calm. Sarah was tall and lean, her dark hair pulled back into a braid, and her face weathered from years in the field. She knelt beside James, eyes sweeping the den, the mother bear, then the cub, which still hadn't left. "This isn't normal," she murmured. "That cub should be hiding, not sitting guard like this. They're not supposed to know we can help." Still, she didn't question it further. There wasn't time. Working with steady hands, she prepared a mild sedative, just enough to dull the pain without compromising the unborn cubs. With James and Emily watching from just outside the den's reach, Sarah gently administered the injection, then waited, checking the mother's breathing with every passing minute. When the sedation settled, she began to clean the wound, flushing out the infected pus and mud, clipping back matted fur, and finally administering a long-acting antibiotic. She never rushed, never hesitated. The cub watched her work, eyes tracking every motion. By the time the wound was cleaned and dressed, the mother bear was still groggy but breathing easier. Her body no longer shuddered with pain at every breath. Sarah leaned back on her haunches and sighed. We've bought her time. That's all we can do for now. That night, James couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the cub, how it hadn't growled, hadn't retreated, how it had waited for them and trusted them. Trust. That was the word. He'd never seen it like that before. The wild didn't trust. It survived. It hid. It fought. But this cub had stepped into a clearing and looked two humans in the eye and asked for something. Over the next several days, James and Emily returned with food and fresh water, always approaching quietly, always watching from a distance. Sarah checked the wound periodically and set up a trail camera just outside the den. The footage confirmed what they were seeing in person. The cub never left for long. It would forage briefly, then return. Sometimes it curled around its mother. Other times it simply sat nearby, always watching, always guarding. Emily started calling it Shadow because of how it moved, silent, cautious, and always nearby. The name stuck. On the fifth day, the camera captured something extraordinary. The mother stirred. She shifted with great effort, her body tensing and twitching. Labor had begun. Shadow stood at the edge of the den, unmoving. And one by one, the cubs were born. 3 small, squirming bodies, slick and weak and new to the world. The mother nudged each of them gently, licking their fur, drawing them in. And Shadow, rather than being confused or scared, sat like a sentinel, his dark eyes shining in the low light of the forest. That night, James and Emily stood beside Sarah as they reviewed the footage. None of them spoke for a long time. Then James, voice low, said, "He brought us to her, and now he's guarding them like it's his job." Sarah leaned back, rubbing the back of her neck. "He's more than just a cub now. He's something else." Emily nodded slowly. "He's family." And none of them said it aloud, but the truth settled among them like the snow outside. Shadow had stepped out of the wild and into something unknown, something brave, something extraordinary. This is what it wanted us to see, James thought. Eyes locked on the injured bear whose breath came in soft, shallow gasps, every rise and fall of her belly a quiet testament to how close she was to breaking. The cub, silent, watchful, remained only a few steps ahead, its ears tilted back, gaze flitting between the officers and its mother. It didn't growl or move to defend her. It simply stayed close, as if guarding her by will alone. Emily's voice came low and steady. "We need Sarah. This is beyond us." She stepped carefully back and brought the radio to her lips, contacting Wildlife Services. Static crackled, then a voice confirmed a team would be dispatched. James kept his distance, crouched low, watching the cub. Something about it unsettled him. Not fear, but the eerie calmness, as if it understood more than it should, as if it had waited for them, chosen them, and led them here with a purpose. 30 minutes later, the snow-muted silence broke with the soft crunch of new footsteps. Dr. Sarah Martinez arrived with her assistant, hauling 2 heavy field kits. Her face was flushed from the cold, but focused, her dark eyes scanning the den and its wounded inhabitant. "We'll need to sedate her, but just enough to treat that leg. Can't risk stressing her too much. She's too close." The cub stood its ground as Sarah approached, not moving, not retreating, only watching. James moved forward slowly, arms slightly raised, and spoke gently to it. "It's okay. We're trying to help." Shadow, Emily had begun calling it that for the way it lingered at the edge of everything, tilted its head, but didn't move. Sarah set to work swiftly. She loaded the tranquilizer, careful to calculate a dosage just strong enough to dull pain and allow for treatment without putting the unborn cubs at risk. The dart landed with a whisper against the mother's flank. Her body stiffened, then slowly relaxed into stillness. Her breathing remained steady. The team moved in. They worked quietly, delicately, cleaning the deep gash, flushing out the infection, applying antibiotics in a slow-release topical that would last through the week. "Looks like a fight," Sarah murmured. "Maybe another bear, or wolves, but she's tough." She held on. James glanced at the cub. "Because of him." Over the next hour, the scene transformed from a moment of crisis into a fragile peace. The mother bear slept, her body no longer trembling, and Shadow moved to rest his head gently against her paw, curling up beside her like a sentinel. Sarah packed up her kit, her eyes lingering on the cub. That behavior's not normal. Not just the approaching humans. How he stayed, how he led you here, it's rare. Very rare. Do you think he was raised near people? Emily asked. Maybe an early interaction? Cubs imprint easier than you'd think. Sarah shook her head slowly. Maybe. But this feels like something else. He didn't imprint. He chose. There's a difference. That night, back in town, James couldn't stop thinking about it. About the way Shadow had looked at him. Not like prey, not like a threat, but something else entirely. As if they'd made a silent pact, one the cub intended to honor. Sarah coordinated a plan. The den would be monitored by motion-activated cameras, their feeds sent to her laptop. The team would return every other day, leaving food and checking the area from a safe distance. They couldn't interfere too much. The wild had to run its course, but quietly, just under the surface, they would watch and hope. Over the next week, they returned faithfully, sometimes together, sometimes alone, always keeping their distance. On the fifth day, the feed caught the moment they had all been waiting for. It was early morning, the forest still wrapped in soft mist and snow, when the mother bear stirred. She turned her massive head, nudged at her belly, and the camera caught the subtle, unmistakable shift. She was going into labor. Sarah and Emily sat in Sarah's office, barely breathing as they watched the feed. James arrived minutes later, breathless and flushed. Is it happening? Emily nodded. It's happening. The labor was long, stretched across hours. The den remained quiet except for the subtle sounds of movement, soft grunts of effort, and the occasional rustle of dry leaves. And then, one by one, they appeared. 3 tiny cubs, slick with birth, their cries like whispers against the winter silence. The mother nuzzled each one close, licking them clean, curling around them in a slow, protective circle. Shadow, for his part, remained nearby the entire time. He didn't interfere, didn't attempt to approach, but he didn't leave either. He lay just outside the curve of her body, his head up, eyes wide and unblinking. Sarah watched with narrowed eyes. I've never seen anything like this. He's their brother, James said softly, and already their guardian. As the snow fell gently outside the windows, blanketing the world in stillness and light, a new family came into being, hidden in the quiet heart of the forest. The officers didn't speak much that evening. The images replayed themselves in James's mind long after the feed went dark. Shadow's vigil, the soft squeaks of newborns, the powerful, weary sigh of their mother as she curled around them. The forest had offered them a rare and quiet miracle, and James couldn't shake the feeling that they had only begun to understand what it meant. Shadow had not merely called for help. He had chosen to trust them, to breach the boundary between species, between wild and human, and in doing so, he had created something new. A bridge, a question, a challenge. Would they be worthy of it? The snow had begun to melt in slow, silvery streaks, dripping from pine branches and pooling on mossy stones as winter grudgingly loosened its grip on the Flagstaff Highlands. In the weeks that followed the birth of the cubs, the forest seemed to exhale. The chill in the air softened, and the quiet became less ominous and more peaceful, like a sacred silence preserved for the growing family nestled deep within the den. The trail cameras continued to stream footage to Sarah's laptop, and each morning she, James or Emily, would sift through the clips like searching through dreams, tender, hidden moments of wildlife unfolding without spectacle. They watched as the mother began to rise more easily, her wound healing, her body less strained. The cubs, impossibly small at first, began to wiggle and yawn, to nuzzle their mother's belly and fumble toward her warmth with clumsy insistence. But more than anything, they watched Shadow. He was always there. At times, he sat at the edge of the frame, half in darkness, his body still as stone. Other times, he ventured nearer, laying beside his siblings, letting them crawl over him, their tiny paws batting at his ears. He licked them gently, nudged them into place when they tumbled too far, and rested his head atop the mother's hind leg as if anchoring her to the earth. There was a quiet wisdom in him that unnerved the team. Cubs didn't act this way. Not toward humans, not even toward their own kind, not like this. He never left the den for long, foraged only enough to keep going. And every time James visited to drop off food, even from a respectful distance, he could feel Shadow watching him. Not with suspicion, but with recognition. That understanding never faded. In fact, it deepened. One afternoon, James parked at the base of the ridge and hiked up alone, arms heavy with a container of raw fish and berries. The forest was quiet except for the occasional bird call, and the ground was beginning to thaw in soft patches beneath his boots. As he approached the drop site, he spotted Shadow just beyond the boulder near the den entrance, half concealed in the brush. James slowed, raising his hand slightly. "Just dropping dinner, buddy," he said, voice low. Shadow didn't move. He didn't retreat either. Instead, he stepped forward just a single pace and sat down. James stood still, heart ticking loud in his ears. They looked at each other across a 10-foot gap. Then James placed the food on the flat stone and stepped back. Shadow watched him go, eyes steady, unblinking. Back at the office, Sarah reviewed the footage again and again. "This behavior, it's learned," she said, "but not taught by people. Not in the usual way. He's figured us out on his own terms." Emily leaned in beside her. "You're saying he's choosing trust again, over and over?" Sarah nodded. "Come. And it's not because he's tame, he's not conditioned, he's not begging or associating us with food like some problem bears do. It's deeper. He's reading us." That revelation brought more than admiration. It brought concern. As the weeks passed and the cubs grew stronger, it became increasingly clear that the mother bear would eventually return to her wild routines. Her limp diminished, her strength returned, and she began venturing further from the den for short stretches, always returning before nightfall. The cubs were curious now, play fighting, testing their legs, their instincts kicking in just as nature intended. But Shadow remained different. He no longer mirrored their wariness. When a branch snapped nearby, the younger cubs scrambled to their mother. Shadow stood firm, ears twitching, but his gaze often turned toward the source, not with fear, but with expectation. Sarah knew what that meant before she said it aloud. "He can't go back with them," she said one morning, flipping through notes. "If he's this comfortable with people now, he's at risk. He doesn't have the caution the others are developing, and he'll teach it to them if he stays." The decision came slowly, reluctantly. A sanctuary near Sedona had already offered to take him. The facility specialized in non-releasable predators, animals born in captivity, raised illegally, or in rare cases like Shadow's, those whose wild instincts had been overwritten by something else. "He'll have space," Sarah assured them. "Privacy, trees, dens, interaction with handlers on his terms. Not a zoo, and he'll never be forced to perform. He'll be an ambassador or part of their conservation program, education, awareness. It's the best life we can give him." Emily agreed. James said nothing for a long while. Later that night, he drove out to the forest and sat on the ridge until dark, watching the light from the den flicker in the hidden camera feed on his phone. He saw the mother curled around her sleeping cubs. He saw Shadow slightly apart, awake and facing the woods. James whispered, "You're not just a bear, are you?" When the day came, it was quiet. Shadow had been gradually desensitized to the transport crate over several days. Sarah left pieces of fruit and strips of venison just inside the open door, never closing it, never forcing him. By the 3rd May, he climbed in on his own and curled up to rest. And on the 4th, she gently closed the gate. He didn't panic, he didn't thrash, he merely stood, then sat, then waited. James volunteered to ride in the transport van. It wasn't protocol, but the sanctuary agreed. They knew enough about these kinds of bonds to understand. The van hummed along the highway, the pine trees thinning as red rock cliffs came into view. Shadow rested inside his crate, eyes open, head low. James sat beside him, a hand braced lightly on the metal mesh, not touching, but close. "I used to think I'd seen everything this job had to show me," James said softly. "But you changed something. You reminded me." He chuckled once, the sound barely above the hum of the road. "I was ready to retire before this winter. Been saying it for years. Paperwork, early mornings, same trails, same stories. But then you walked out of the woods, looked me in the eye, and told me something mattered." Shadow blinked slowly, his breathing steady. You saved your family, James said. You led us there. You trusted. And because of you, I remembered why I started all this in the first place. They arrived just after noon. The sanctuary was nestled at the edge of a canyon, surrounded by tall fencing disguised among the trees, the landscape natural and sprawling. Shadow was released into a transitional enclosure first, half a wooded acre, complete with a small den, a pond, climbing structures. He didn't bolt, he didn't hide. He walked a few paces in, sniffed the air, and then, turning to glance back at James, he disappeared into the trees. The handlers watched quietly. One of them, a younger woman with freckles and a calm voice, smiled. He's going to be good here, I can feel it. James didn't speak for a moment. Then he nodded. Yeah, me too. As he walked back toward the van, the wind picked up, rustling through the leaves. For a heartbeat, it sounded like a voice, a quiet exhale, not of loss, but of something given freely and received in kind. Shadow's legacy, James knew, wouldn't be measured by where he ended up, but by the bridge he'd built between fear and trust, between wildness and compassion. And it was only beginning. The road to Sedona wound through sweeping red canyons and thick forests of ponderosa pine, the late spring sun casting gold over the high cliffs as the sanctuary truck rumbled steadily onward. Inside the padded crate in the back, Shadow lay curled, not asleep but still, his dark eyes open and calm, as if he understood the journey's weight. James sat beside him, his back braced against the sidewall of the truck, legs crossed, hands clasped loosely in his lap. He hadn't spoken much during the ride, but he'd checked on Shadow every few minutes, murmuring soft assurances, more for himself than for the cub. Not the life you were born for, he whispered once, but maybe the life you chose. When the truck arrived at the sanctuary gates, a team of handlers waited quietly, respectful of the moment. There was no fanfare, no flashing cameras or eager crowds, just low voices, soft footfalls, and an understanding that this animal wasn't here to entertain. He was here to represent something deeper. Shadow stepped from the crate without hesitation. He looked around, ears flicking as he took in the large forested enclosure, the boulders and climbing logs, the scent of pine and soil. James watched him go, and when the cub reached the edge of the habitat's shaded pool, he turned his head, just once, before padding into the trees. James's throat tightened. That was goodbye, but not an ending. At the sanctuary, Shadow settled into a new kind of rhythm. He remained curious about his surroundings, but never frantic. He explored, learned the boundaries of his new home, and showed no signs of stress. He seemed to understand, as he had understood everything since that first strange day, that this was the next step. Within weeks, he began responding to the quiet presence of staff members. Not tricks, not commands, but relationships. They sat with him during feeding times, read aloud from books, sometimes simply shared the silence. He never begged. He never lunged. He watched. He listened. He engaged on his terms, never losing the quiet dignity that had made his first encounter so unforgettable. The sanctuary director, a wiry woman named Dr. Leah Rivers, was the first to suggest it. Shadow could be our conservation ambassador, she told Sarah during a check-in call. He's not just tolerant of people, he seems to sense when someone's listening. The way kids respond to him, it's empathy. They don't see a dangerous animal. They see something they recognize, a soul. And so Shadow became part of the sanctuary's outreach efforts, not as a spectacle, but as a bridge. School children came by the dozens, filing quietly through the educational corridor that overlooked his enclosure. They stood at the glass, pointing softly when he approached, whispering stories to each other. One little girl pressed her hand to the barrier and murmured, "He looks like he understands sadness." And maybe he did. Word of Shadow spread beyond the region. Journalists came, not to exploit, but to witness. Emily, deeply moved by what she saw, wrote an article for a national wildlife journal. The cub who asked for help went viral. In it, she described their first meeting in the forest, the trust in Shadow's eyes, the strange grace with which he remained. He was never just a bear, she wrote. He was a question posed by nature itself. What if the wild called for help and trusted you to answer? Her words stirred something beyond sympathy. They stirred responsibility. Letters poured into the sanctuary, children sending drawings, researchers expressing interest. lawmakers debating new funding for bear corridor protections across Arizona and the Southwest. Shadow had become more than a rescued animal. He was a living reminder that the line between human and wild wasn't always meant to divide. Sometimes it was meant to guide. For James, life shifted in a quieter, slower arc. Retirement had loomed on the horizon like a promised escape. Weeks of rest, an end to paperwork, and a quiet porch from which to watch the birds. But Shadow had changed something in him, had woken a part of his heart that he didn't know had gone dormant. He found himself restless when the office buzzed about new wildlife incidents. He couldn't sit still during staff meetings anymore. When Sarah mentioned a volunteer position opening with the state's Wildlife Anti-Poaching Task Force, he signed up without a second thought. His badge might retire, but his mission wouldn't. On his first day in the field, James clipped a small photo to his notebook, a still from the trail cam, capturing Shadow standing guard outside the den, snow dusting his fur, eyes turned towards something unseen. The image reminded him why he did this. Not to chase shadows, but to protect them. The months passed, the seasons turned, the three younger cubs, now old enough to venture with their mother, had vanished into the deep woods. Wild, wary, unknown. Sarah reviewed occasional remote camera footage, catching glimpses of them. They were strong, quick, thriving. She liked to think Shadow had taught them something too. One spring day, James returned to the sanctuary. He hadn't visited in months, too wrapped up in field work and reports, but something had called him back. He stood at the glass wall of Shadow's habitat, watching as the now larger bear paced along a sun-warmed ridge, sniffed the air, then sat, facing the trees. After a few minutes, Shadow turned, catching sight of James. For a moment, they simply looked at each other across the space, the world going still again, just like it had that morning in the forest. James didn't move, didn't speak. He didn't need to. Shadow took 3 slow steps toward the barrier, then stopped and lowered his head slightly. A gesture that wasn't submission, wasn't fear. It was something older, familiar. Acknowledgement. James smiled. "You remember," he whispered. "Of course you do." As he walked back to his truck, the sun dipping low behind the red rock cliffs, James felt something settle in his chest, not closure, but peace. Shadow's journey had begun with a question, a silent cry in the woods, a plea carried not in words but in courage. And it had ended not with confinement, but with purpose. He hadn't been rescued. He had offered himself in trust. In doing so, he'd changed the lives of everyone who followed him into the forest. And long after the snow had melted, long after the cubs had grown and scattered, and the trees had greened and turned again, his story would remain, a thread stitched gently between species, a living reminder of what could happen when the wild reached out and we, for once, listened. Baby Bear recognizes the man who saved him. What happens next is unbelievable. The sweltering August sun bore down over Montana's Flathead National Forest like a furnace, casting waves of heat through the parched canopy and turning the once vibrant greens of the landscape into brittle shades of ochre and brown. Wildlife Ranger Mike Harrington maneuvered his dusty patrol truck along a narrow fire road, the wheels crunching over loose gravel as he scanned the tree line with practiced eyes. At 42, Mike was as much a part of this forest as the towering ponderosa pines that had watched him grow from rookie to seasoned guardian over 2 decades. He had seen firestorms sweep through valleys and floods, carve new paths into the earth. But this year's drought had been different, merciless, slow, a suffocating grip that drained the life from everything it touched. Streams that once babbled with trout now lay dry, their beds cracked like old skin. Meadows that teemed with elk were silent, brittle, and ghost-like. Even the wind seemed reluctant to blow, as though conserving energy in this exhausted wilderness. Crossing a sun-baked ravine, Mike slowed his truck, bumped to a halt, as something caught his eye. A shape slumped and motionless beside what used to be a creek. He climbed out cautiously, boots crunching over stones, his instincts alert. A sow grizzly. Her body splayed unnaturally against the dust, her coat dulled and crusted with dirt. Beside her, barely visible against her massive bulk, was a cub. It was moving barely, its tiny form, pressing repeatedly against the mother's ribs as if trying to wake her. Mike's breath hitched. He knew the protocol. Observe, report, do not interfere. But then came the sound. a soft, ragged whimper that cut through the stillness like a splinter. It wasn't just noise, it was heartbreak, a sound filled with panic confusion and an aching need for comfort. He hesitated only a moment longer before descending the ravine. The cub noticed him immediately, tensing, baring baby teeth with a low growl, more pitiful than threatening. Its golden brown fur was dull with dust and tangled with burrs, eyes defiant yet sunken. Mike crouched low, voice gentle as a breeze. Easy, little one. I'm not here to hurt you. And he stayed there, still speaking softly, not moving beyond the shift of his weight. The cub snarled again, then whimpered, then collapsed beside its mother as if the effort of resistance was too great. It was minutes before it lifted its head again, panting, watching Mike inched forward, arms extended but open-palmed. He whispered anything that came to mind. Songs, memories, apologies. Slowly, achingly slowly, the cub inched toward him. When it finally let its head rest against his outstretched hand, he swallowed the lump in his throat and moved to gather it into his arms. It was feather-light, limp, the kind of weight that spoke of danger. Mike wrapped it in his flannel overshirt and turned back to the truck. Running, his drive to the Flathead Wildlife Rehabilitation Center was a blur of desperate speed. He called ahead, alerting them to prepare. By the time he arrived, Dr. Jessica Monroe was already at the door, sleeves rolled up, eyes sharp behind her glasses. Mike barely made it through the threshold before Jessica took the cub from his arms. Severe dehydration, blood sugars crashing. He's on the edge, she murmured, already placing an IV. We'll start fluids and bring him under the heat lamp. We need to get his body temp back up. Mike stood there, useless heart thudding, as the cub was whisked into a treatment room. He didn't leave. He paced the hallway like an anxious parent, his ranger's badge heavy in his pocket. He knew there would be consequences. Knew the rules, the paperwork, the hearings. He'd broken federal wildlife protocol, but when he thought about the cub's cries, he'd do it all again. Hours later, the door opened. Jessica stepped out, her features softened. He's stable. Still weak, but out of immediate danger, Mike. You might have saved him with just minutes to spare. She gave him a faint smile. Want to see him in the recovery room, the cub lay curled on a blanket under a warm glow. A tiny tangle of limbs and fur. Jessica handed Mike a bottle fitted with a rubber nipple. You're on feeding duty? Mike chuckled, surprised by the lump in his throat. What's his name? She looked down at the cub's golden brown coat, which shimmered like a sunset under the lamp. We're calling him Sundown. The next 2 days passed in a rhythm foreign to Mike's ranger life. Bottle feedings every few hours, swaddling the cub in warm blankets, whispering to him through the long, quiet nights. Mike slept on a cot in the corner of the hallway. Never far, he noted everything. Sundown's appetite returning, the brightness creeping back into his eyes, how his tiny claws scratched at the air during dreams. On the 4th day, Mike received the call he knew was coming. His superior at the Bureau of Land Management was terse. You disobeyed a direct wildlife intervention protocol. Your actions, though well-intentioned, undermine field integrity. 2 weeks suspension without pay. Mike thanked them. No argument. He hung up and went back to Sundown's room where the cub was trying to gnaw on the blanket. Worth it, he whispered. When Sundown was strong enough, he was moved to the Flathead Bear Sanctuary, where rewilding experts would begin the delicate process of preparing him for eventual release. Mike helped load the crate, resting a hand gently on the cub's head before the door closed. Sundown licked his fingers, once, then turned, settling quietly inside. As the van pulled away, Mike watched until it vanished around the bend. He would have stayed longer, but he had to step back for the cub's sake. Still, as he returned to his solitary cabin nestled on the forest edge, the silence felt different now. Emptier as he sat on his porch that evening, drink in hand, his thoughts wandered to the cub's defiant eyes. The streak of white across his brow that caught the sun like frost. Somewhere deep inside, he had the sense that their story wasn't over, that fate had only just opened the first page. The Flathead Bear Sanctuary stretched across hundreds of acres of rugged Montana wilderness, a landscape of pines and open meadows stitched together with winding creeks and hidden dens. Here, animals found not cages but purpose, not captivity but healing. Sundown, the golden brown cub with the distinctive white facial blaze, arrived in a quiet hum of wheels on gravel and cautious hope. His crate opened to the scent of pine needles and the distant trill of chickadees. At first, Sundown stayed pressed to the back wall, his small body wary and still. But the air carried the language of the wild, and he knew that remembered it. His nose twitched, his ears turned. Slowly, Sundown stepped into his new world. Waiting near the fence line was Abby Carson, 21 years old, and already deep in her doctoral work studying bear behavior. With her hair tucked into a ponytail and her boots caked with mud, she crouched silently, notebook in hand. Her job was observation, not interference. But even from those first tentative steps, she noticed something different about this cub. While most rescues retreated for days or weeks before engaging, Sundown watched her with open curiosity. He didn't approach, not yet, but he didn't hide either. His gaze was steady, even bold. Abby made a note of it, circling her words twice: unusual social behavior, possible early human bonding. Over the weeks, Sundown acclimated. He began eating solid food, digging up grubs, clumsily chasing insects across sun-warmed rocks. He splashed through shallow streams with the awkward joy only a young animal could embody. He grew stronger, his coat regaining its sunlit sheen, the white streak on his face now a striking signature. But he remained attentive. He would pause mid-play to watch Abby as she sketched in her notebook. Ears pricked whenever she read aloud the behavioral logs to herself. Most of the time, she forgot she was being studied too. He made her smile often. Once during a quiet moment, she murmured, "You miss him, don't you?" Sundown didn't respond, of course, but he sat down before her, curling his paw under him as if to stay a while. She jotted another note: possible memory retention of human bond. Strong imprint elsewhere. Mike Harrington spent his suspension restoring trails near Glacier National Park and trying not to think about the silence that followed Sundown's departure. He told himself it was the right thing, that the cub needed distance now to reconnect with its wild self. But every time he passed a stream bed, he imagined the cub drinking. Every time he heard a rustle in the brush, he wondered if Sundown would have chased it. Back at work weeks later, Mike kept tabs on the sanctuary's quarterly reports and even donated anonymously to their new enclosure project. But he never visited. Not until 5 years later, when life turned back toward the unexpected. By then, Mike had transitioned to the Bureau of Land Management's outreach coordinator role, a position that put him back among people more than animals. He missed the field, but found purpose in education and making sure others cared enough to protect what he loved. It was in this capacity that he joined Abby's new research team, now fully funded and focused on long-term bear rewilding outcomes. The project brought him back to Flathead, to the same mountains and winding trails, this time armed with telemetry equipment and a clipboard. They were tracking collars now, reliable GPS units used to chart migration patterns, diet shifts, denning behaviors. Sundown was one of their subjects, though not by name. In the files, he was Bear 912G, a male grizzly of remarkable size and stable health, reintroduced near Mount Ishbel. Abby briefed the team on his history, omitting details. She instinctively knew Mike wouldn't want publicly tied back to him. But her voice softened when she mentioned the cub's rapid early recovery and unusual social cognition. Mike asked no questions, but his gaze lingered on the photograph, a still frame from a trail camera showing a broad-shouldered bear drinking from a creek. The distinctive white blaze clear even in grainy pixels. Late one afternoon, the team hiked into a remote basin to place new trail cameras and check scent marking stations. Abby was explaining claw rake markings when a rustle snapped their attention to the tree line. A bear stood there, half-shadowed by a line of quaking aspen. Not just any bear, Sundown, older, bigger, a powerful presence carved by years of survival. His fur gleamed with healthy oils, and his stance was alert but calm. Mike stepped forward without thinking, a soft gasp escaping him. Sundown, he whispered. The name broke across the space between them like a memory spoken aloud. The bear's ears lifted, his body stilled. Then impossibly, Sundown stepped forward. The researchers froze, whispering, fumbling for cameras. Abby raised her binoculars, breath held. Sundown ambled forward, not with aggression or confusion, but with a familiarity that defied explanation. He reached Mike, nose twitching, and then gently nudged Mike's hand with his broad head, the same motion he used to make in the rehab center when hungry, when seeking warmth. Mike's hand trembled as he reached to stroke the thick fur behind Sundown's ear. "You remember," he breathed, "after all this time." Sundown let out a low, steady rumble, not warning, but greeting, a vibration of recognition. Abby, stunned, captured the moment on video. Within hours, the footage traveled across the globe. Social media dubbed it the Sundown Encounter. Scientists debated the implications for Earthscene memory and interspecies recognition. Conservationists hailed it as proof of deeper emotional and cognitive lives in animals. Dr. Eleanor Winters, a leading animal cognition researcher, called it a watershed moment in understanding the mammalian memory arc. Donations flooded the Flathead Bear Sanctuary, funding soared by 300%, and suddenly the quiet bond between one man and one cub became a symbol of something far greater. Weeks later, Mike stood again at the sanctuary's gate, this time as a guest. Sundown, still collared and semi-wild, was living in a transition zone, a space for adult bears nearing full release but still monitored. When Mike entered the zone's observation deck, Sundown appeared at the tree line within minutes. He didn't approach right away, but his ears flicked and he let out a soft huff, a greeting. Abby joined Mike on the deck with 2 steaming mugs of coffee, her eyes warm. "He never does that for anyone else," she said. "You left a deeper imprint than even we understood." They sat in silence for a while, watching the bear wander, dig, sniff, and finally sit under a tree. Abby spoke again, slower this time. "I've been thinking, what if we created something lasting from this? Something bigger than just a research moment?" Mike turned to her, curious. "Like what?" She smiled. "A foundation for cognition. Research, sanctuary expansion, community education. We could call it the Sundown Foundation." Mike sipped his coffee and looked back at the bear resting under pine shade. He nodded slowly. "Let's do it." 6 months later, the Sundown Foundation launched with support from universities, nonprofits, and nature preserves. Its mission to explore the emotional memory of wildlife, support sanctuaries for aging and injured bears, and create education programs to inspire the next generation of conservationists. Abby led research efforts that uncovered complex behaviors in grizzlies previously dismissed as coincidence. Mike visited schools telling Sundown's story to wide-eyed children, passing around photos and urging them to see wildlife not as threats or curiosities, but as fellow passengers on the earth. The bear in the photo, once a whimpering cub cradled against a ranger's chest, had become more than a memory. He was a living bridge between species, between instinct and compassion, between survival and kinship. And even as Sundown grew more wild with each season, more distant, the thread between him and Mike never snapped. Not fully, it simply stretched like a tether of sunlight over a long, open valley. Unseen but never unfelt, a story still unfolding beneath the sky. Ready for Chapter 3 when you are. The video of Sundown's approach to Mike spread like fire in dry grass. It was more than viral, it was a cultural spark. News anchors choked up, retelling the story. Conservation blogs dubbed it "the bear who remembered." And within a week, national wildlife agencies were fielding interviews about cognition in bears, creatures long viewed as solitary and instinct-driven. The footage, raw and quietly powerful, showed Sundown emerging from the trees like a memory made flesh. The camera trembled as he paused, head lifting, body still except for a single breath. Mike's voice, barely above a whisper, trembled with disbelief. "Sundown." Then, with the grace of something ancient and sacred, the bear approached, not lumbering, not aggressive, a deliberate walk, a gesture of familiarity, of home. He nudged Mike's hand like an echo from 5 years past, and the world stopped. Scientists had theories. Some spoke of olfactory imprinting. Others hypothesized that long-term associative memory might exist in species previously thought, too, instinct-bound for such nuance. But for Mike, none of that mattered. He knew. It wasn't just a smell or a flicker of recognition. It was a bond, formed in heat and hunger and gentleness and need. The kind of connection you don't forget, even across time and wilderness. In the following days, experts like Dr. Eleanor Winters, a cognitive ethologist at the University of Washington, weighed in with cautious awe. "We have documented elephant mourning, chimpanzee sign language, even orca dialects," she said during one broadcast. "But this is a new frontier." If Sundown truly remembered Mike, after all this time, it challenges everything we assumed about grizzly bear cognition. The attention brought unexpected consequences. Donations to the Flathead Bear Sanctuary surged by 300%. Volunteers doubled. Schools across the state requested guest speakers from the project. One morning, Abby found herself fielding calls from a documentary crew and a children's book publisher in the same hour. And through it all, Sundown remained at the center, a golden brown beacon of what could happen when compassion met wilderness with respect and care. Mike visited the sanctuary 2 weeks later. Sundown was still semi-wild, living within the vast perimeter that mimicked his natural habitat, but the staff had noticed his patterns. He came to the edge more often when Mike arrived, not like a pet, not dependent, but present. Curious one late afternoon as the sun dipped low and turned the fields to molten amber, Mike stood by the observation blind. Sundown ambled toward the fence, his white facial blaze catching the light. He paused, then lowered his head through the open partition between the protected zone and the inner barrier. Mike crouched. "Hey there, old friend," he said softly. Sundown let out a low chuff, and for a few minutes there was no sound but the wind moving through the grass, the rhythm of their shared breath. That evening over coffee in the research trailer, Mike and Abby talked until the stars burned silver above the mountains. They spoke not just of Sundown, but of the future, of what his story had stirred in people, of what it could become. "There's more here than just emotion," Abby said, her eyes alive with thought. "There's science, storytelling, education. If this connection challenges what we think we know, we owe it to Sundown and every bear out there to follow that trail." Mike nodded, his hands wrapped around the enamel mug. "We could build something," he said slowly. "Not just a sanctuary, a foundation for research, for outreach, for kids who've never even seen a wild animal but still care." And that night, with stars spilling over the trees like seeds, the Sundown Foundation was born, not yet in ink, but in resolve. 6 months later, it had a name, a mission, and a team. The Sundown Foundation launched with grants from 2 universities, crowdfunding from over 40,000 individual donors, and a matching contribution from a philanthropist who had once wept watching the Sundown video on her flight from Zurich. Its goals were ambitious: fund advanced research into animal memory and cognition, improve sanctuary infrastructure for long-term rehabilitation, and develop immersive educational programs for rural and urban schools alike. Abby oversaw the science. Mike, with his background in outreach and public policy, took charge of community partnerships. They built a mobile exhibit, an interactive truck called the Wild Mine, that brought touchscreen displays, VR bear habitats, and real-time GPS bear tracking data to schools and libraries. In classrooms, children traced Sundown's story across wall-sized maps, watching his migration paths and learning how bears adapted to climate change, forest loss, and human encroachment. In one classroom, a boy named Daniel raised his hand after the video presentation and asked, "Do you think he misses Mike when he's far away?" Mike, standing at the back, blinked away, something in his eye. "Maybe," he said, "but I think he carries part of me with him, just like I carry him." Meanwhile, the sanctuary expanded. Older bears, once deemed unfit for release, found new purpose in the elder enclosure designed with comfort, stimulation, and dignity. Abby led research on their social structures, compiling a study that would later be published in Nature Wildlife Quarterly titled "Echoes in the Pines: Memory Retention and Social Bonds in Rescued Grizzlies." For Sundown, the wild always called. He spent more and more time in the outer range, roaming higher, farther, returning only intermittently. He had changed, grown. His body was now massive, his stride full of confidence, but he remained gentle in his encounters with the sanctuary team. One spring, he was spotted leading 2 younger bears toward a prime foraging ridge, behavior rarely seen outside maternal patterns. Abby noted it with awe. He's mentoring. That's not instinct, that's memory, turned to guidance. 5 years passed since that day in the woods, when Sundown had stepped out of legend and into recognition. Mike, now in his late 40s, had grown silver at the temples. Abby, no longer the quiet field researcher, was a keynote speaker at global conservation forums. And Sundown, now 10, had begun to linger at the edge of the sanctuary, watching the ridgelines beyond. He paced, more vocalized occasionally. The signs were clear. He was ready. Not just for space, for freedom. The sanctuary had given him safety, but the wild still lived in his bones. And so one mist-streaked morning, Mike and Abby walked with him to the boundary gate. He was collarless now. Microchipped, yes, but otherwise unmarked. A free bear. A wild bear. They opened the gate, and Sundown stood still. He looked back once, eyes locking on Mike. Then Abby, then forward again. He stepped into the wilderness with purpose, his body moving like it remembered every tree, every river, every wind-worn path. Ahead, a distant group of bears stirred. Sundown paused, then trotted toward them, joining their rhythm like he had always belonged. Mike wiped his eyes with the sleeve of his flannel. Abby stood beside him, silent. "He's home," Mike said, his voice breaking, but proud. "And he's carrying a piece of us with him." Abby nodded, whispering, "And we carry him too." Behind them, the gate stood open, wind rustling the tall grass. Sundown's story wasn't over, but it was his now, entirely. The sun rose slowly over the expanse of Flathead National Forest, bathing the mountain ridges in gold and amber as mist curled through the pines like breath. The mornings had grown quieter in the sanctuary, though not emptier. Something had shifted in the air since sundown's release. Not a hole, but an echo. A lingering warmth where presence used to be. Mike Harrington still walked the outer trails each week, boots crunching through soft pine needles and gravel, eyes scanning the forest as though sundown might appear again just for a moment out of the brush. He never did, but Mike had stopped expecting him. Instead, he came to listen, to feel, to remember. Sometimes the breeze would move through the trees just right, and Mike would swear he heard that low chuff the one sundown gave when recognizing a friend. It wasn't loss. It was something deeper, a knowing, a quiet, enduring tether. Back at the sanctuary's headquarters, things had blossomed in Sundown's wake. The Sundown Foundation had grown into a national network. Grants now supported sanctuaries in Oregon, Colorado, and Alberta. Their curriculum on wildlife, empathy, and cognition had been adopted in over 200 schools, sparking a generation of students to think not just about animals, but with them. Abby Carson, now 30, wore her leadership as naturally as her field jacket. She still walked the enclosures, still tracked wild collars, but more and more she spoke to rooms full of policymakers and young scientists. Her voice carrying stories that began with a cub in crisis and ended with a bear in flight. And yet, despite all the accolades and progress, Sundown remained more than a success story. He had become myth-real and rooted, but carried like a fable. Children wrote letters to him. Artists painted murals of his golden fur and white blaze. Park rangers named trails after him. But to Mike and Abby, he was still just Sundown. The bear who chose to trust. 5 years passed, seasons churned with familiar rhythm. Snowstorms and spring melt, berry bloom, and rut. Cameras caught glimpses of Sundown every few months. Paw prints in the snow, fur against a tree trunk, a silhouette against a sunset ridge. He was thriving. His range had expanded far beyond the sanctuary's bounds, pushing north into Glacier's remote corridors and east into tribal lands, where ancient stories told of spirit bears, guides between earth and sky. Once Abby received a blurry trail cam image from a Blackfeet conservation group. "We think this might be your bear," the message read. He was bigger now, his face broader, white patch unmistakable even in shadow. He moved with purpose, alone but not isolated. Abby printed the photo and tacked it on the office wall beside the original. A cub curled in a blanket, eyes half-lidded, mouth stained with formula. From then on, every update was a gift. Proof not just of Sundown's survival, but his sovereignty, his choice. Still, Mike couldn't shake a feeling that something more was coming. A shift. Not danger, not closure, just a turning point. And he was right. It happened in early spring. The mountains were still kissed with snow, but the thaw had begun. Streams rushed with melted ice. The air carried scents of pine and damp earth. Mike was at the sanctuary helping coordinate a reforestation program when a call came through. A wildlife researcher from a neighboring range had spotted a lone grizzly behaving unusually, watching campsites from a distance, leaving no signs of aggression, but remaining nearby for days at a time. Curious calm, always just on the edge of vision. The descriptions made Mike's skin prickle. A golden coat, a white blaze like moonlight. Abby confirmed it with a team check-in. The collarless bear matched Sundown's markers. But more intriguing was his behavior. He wasn't looking for food. He wasn't asserting territory. He was waiting, so Mike went. Not to reclaim, not to interfere, but to witness. The site was remote, nestled in a high glade between ridges dotted with fresh bear tracks, and a few flattened spots where something large had bedded down. Mike arrived alone, carrying only a light pack and a folding chair. He sat as the sky shifted from blue to rust. And then, just as the first stars bloomed, Sundown appeared. He moved out from the tree line with deliberate calm, his massive form backlit by dusk. Mike didn't stand, didn't speak. He simply opened his hands. Sundown stopped several feet away, studying him. The bear was magnificent, 10 years old now. Fur thick with winter weight, eyes deep with a world Mike would never know. For a long time, they simply watched each other. Then Sundown rumbled low in his chest and stepped forward. Not close, just enough. He turned his head westward toward the peaks beyond, then back at Mike. The message was clear. Kind of invitation, not to follow, but to understand. Mike felt it settle in his chest like a sunrise. Sundown had returned to say goodbye, not because he was leaving, but because he wanted to close the circle, and so Mike stood, nodded once and whispered, "Thank you." Sundown moved off, slowly disappearing into the trees like mist into morning. Mike stayed for hours, watching the stars shift and scatter across the sky. When he returned to the sanctuary, he found Abby on the porch, eyes already searching the trail behind him. He shook his head. He's gone. But it was right. Abby didn't ask questions. She just sat beside him, their silence full of something vast and reverent. Over the next months, Sundown was not seen again. Not by cameras, not by rangers, not by tribal monitors. It was as though the forest had folded around him, offering the privacy of legend. But his legacy didn't fade, instead it deepened. The foundation launched a wilderness exchange program, pairing high school students with rangers and biologists for real-time conservation work. The Sundown Scholarship began funding underrepresented youth pursuing wildlife science. Abby's cognitive research was cited in international environmental policy discussions. Mike, now semi-retired, wrote a book, Sundown Memory of the Wild, blending narrative, science and spirit. It became a quiet bestseller. In the final chapter, he wrote, "I once cradled a cub in my arms and thought I was saving his life. What I didn't realize was how much he would give me in return, a second calling, a reason to believe in gentler things." The forest has many voices. If you listen with your heart, one of them will sound like home. Years later, on the edge of the forest where it all began, a stone marker stands beside a trail. No fences, no signs, just one inscription carved into the rock face facing west. For Sundown, who remembered, who returned, who was never truly gone. And beneath it, in smaller print, some bonds are not broken by time, nor distance, nor silence. They are written into the land, the trees, the stars, and into the heart.